Modifying the processing projects to get them to play on web pages. The easiest way is to use P5.js as our way of doing that. So first we're going to take a look at the P5.js complete project and use that as a starting point. So key thing to notice is we have an HTML file. Within this HTML file, it is going to be loading a couple of different items. It's loading the P5 library, and it's also then loading two additional libraries, these add-ons that allow it to work with sound and interact with the DOM. And finally, where all the magic will happen in our project is actually going to be in the sketch file. What you will notice inside of this particular document is there is no actual web page markup. There is no where it says canvas, or it doesn't have headlines and paragraphs or anything else. All we're looking at is a basic empty shell of a page, and then that is then being populated through JavaScript. So the P5 library then reads the sketch file, and then it creates an HTML5 canvas element and then writes to the contents of that through JavaScript. So that is how P5.js works. Now we can have more content on our page. We can add CSS to the page to further control how the overall look and feel of the page is. So we can set the background for the page. We can move this canvas around on the page. So we'll be adding all of that in a little while as we work with it. But first, let's take a look at the actual sketch file that is populating our project. So I've modified it from the shell and added in the create canvas line. This create canvas is the equivalent of processing size command. When I look at what's in the draw, we now have the same kind of content as before. Inside of Atom, if I want to see my page in the browser, I need to be on the HTML file. Then I can choose Open in Browser. When I do that, we can see it now opened up my page inside the web browser. While we're doing this, I'm going to encourage you to always open up the JavaScript console inside of the browser. So under View, find Developer, look for the JavaScript console. And the reason we want to do that is if we have any errors that are showing up, they will be reported to us in this console. Otherwise, we can look at our screen and we may see empty, we may see nothing, or we may see partial functioning and be confused as to what's going on. And there's an error message that's spit out into the console that will tell us exactly which line number the program is unhappy with. So we want to keep that open while we're working. Now if I go back into Atom, look at my sketch, we can see I created a canvas 800 by 600, filled the background color with red, and I drew a rectangle to put that on screen. Now as we want to work, some other differences we'll notice. In processing, we would have said void setup, but here in P5.js, we use the word function. Functions don't need to return a type. They can return whatever we want them to return if we use the return command, but they don't have to actually return a type. So we just replace all of those return types of our functions with the word function. Now, before, we may have said something like float x equals something, but inside of P5.js, instead we are going to use the word var. So I will use var representing variables. So all of our variables, instead of typing them with floats, ints, strings, bools, we now just use the word var. Up until recently, JavaScript was a completely untyped language. The newest iteration of JavaScript does allow for typing if you want to do that, but it's not required or mandatory to do so. So now if I say x equals 100 here, I could now draw my box at x, and if I save this and go back and reload my sketch, we can see it's the same. But what's nice is this now behaves the same as we've seen before, where I can now make X change, save that, go back, refresh, and we can now see that I've created basic animation. So the same kinds of things that we do in processing, the same logic that we would apply for our functions and for our variables and for our programs, none of that's changed. But what we are doing is now changing a little bit of how we work with things, because if I look at one of my simple classes here, we can see that this function returned a Boolean, this function returned nothing, and then how I instantiated these things and set it up. So this is a short one. Some of my other classes, if I go into the unicorn where there's a whole lot more going on, it's going to take a little bit more effort to get this up and running, as I need to convert it into P5.js, because one of the things that is missing while we work with this is inside of this we don't have classes anymore. So what we do is we store our objects inside functions. So JavaScript traditionally has been a prototype-based language, so we create a prototype object using a function, and then we can create new copies of that. So a lot of it behaves the same, but we don't necessarily get to use the same words to describe it. So we won't be using the word class any longer while we convert it over. So the next thing that I want to do is I am going to start making some copies of elements. So I have my original, and then instead of just working with this and then finding along the way that I deleted something I didn't want to delete, what I'm going to do is duplicate the file, and this time when I duplicate it, I will just refer to it as a .js file. But it's going to be the same file. So now I'll have two of each. So I'm going to now create a copy of each one of my processing files as a .js file to give me a starting point. Now I've created copies of all of my files. They're all JS files, so we have the original PD and the JS file. Eventually we'll delete the PDs once we know that our project is running. Something else to keep in mind while we're doing this, we're going to have to go through an exercise in delayed gratification, because once we start doing this process of working on the conversion, we're not going to be able to test our project for a long time. So we're going to have to do a whole bunch of conversion pieces, and then we'll test the project and cross our fingers that things work. But it will just be a matter of deleting errors that show up in the console one line at a time until the whole thing runs. But so be it. That's just going to be how the process works itself out. Now that I have these files here, I'm going to convert all of these files. Then I'm going to be going through an organizational part. Because if I look at the index file, we can see that it loads the sketch file. But if I look here, I'm going to have a bullet.js, an enemy.js, all the way down through a unicorn.js. So I'm going to have to load a whole bunch of additional files here. And it's really easy when you're going through this process. You make conversions and then you forget to add one or more of the files to the actual HTML file, and then you're like, why is it not running? Why can't it see it? What's going on? So it is something that it takes a little doing until we figure out how to get all of the pieces coming together and working properly. So the next part is going to be highly repetitive as we go through and have to convert the different files into their kind of new version of JS. But with it, I think I would rather start out with a basic object first and progressively work to more and more complex files, because then it's a little bit faster and easier to see. Doing the conversion with this, again, we don't have a class anymore. So with that, we get to get rid of a bunch of things. So what we do say is, and a lot of these will just be deleting that first part. And now I put in the keyword function, the object. Now all of this here, I don't have to specify what kind of element is present. I just have to specify that I'm passing in these 4 parameters. And now I have those parameters there. We can get rid of the 1 extra curly brace. And one final thing that we're going to do, so this particular object, it has these 4 variables, x, y, width, and height associated with it. And when we create this object, we pass in the values we want it to be. So when we make an instance of this object, we have to use the word this. Now, one thing that we can do in Atom while we're working is if I click and then hold down Command, and if you're on Windows, it'd be Control, I can click into multiple places. And now if I start typing, it now inserted it all onto those lines. So I didn't have to type this dot multiple times. But what we're doing is when we make an instance of the frame object, each instance will have its own X property, and we specify instance variables, things that are unique to that object, with the word this. So we say this X, this Y, this. So if I have 2 frame objects, each one can have its own X. So that's why we use the word this. All right, so now that takes care of the frame object. Now if I look at the image object is going to be very similar as we work with that. So as long as the variables as they're all up here are being defined inside what was previously my constructor, we can go through and just delete what's up there. Type in the word function. And now the same way that I can insert my cursor right now, I'm holding down Command. And I'm now highlighting multiple sections. So I'm just going to highlight all of these. Right here, hit delete. That gets rid of it in one chunk. Now I'm going to click, hold down Command, and say this dot once more. Oh, I had 2 more. Now, if I look close here, I'm going to notice something. It's really easy when I work with this. I just do the first element. But if I look at W, W is this. So now when I'm referencing it here, I need to also reference it as this W. This is going to overuse the word this morning, but it will be very common to miss putting the word this in front of instance variables inside your functions. And then when you do that, you'll be like, why is it erroring out? Because it'll say it can't find a value. Now processing, if it couldn't find a value, it would default it to 0 and be just fine with that. JavaScript is not so kind. If JavaScript can't find something, it defaults it to null, meaning nothing. And then when it tries to run and it tries to use something that is now nothing, it will generally cause an error. So we have to be a little bit more cautious as we are working with it. If I count out my curly braces, we'll find that I have the wrong number of curly braces because this one goes with here. If this one goes here, I have an extra one. But I need this, which will become a method. Replace the word void with function. So function display fills it with a color. Now X, which actually, there's really no point to fill it with the color when we're drawing an image over it. We just had a color from the beginning. So technically I can get rid of that. And I can also, I think, get rid of the rect here that it's drawing because we're no longer using those. This is from the days before we used images. So both of these we can get rid of. Same command of the / commented out works in JavaScript as well. So we're good there. Now the image command is going to be the same, but image is an instance variable as our x, y, width, and we don't really need height here. We're not using it in this, but it's just left in as part of the object because we potentially could. So if I type this dot, we can now see how it put it in all of that very quickly. So when we're working inside of Atom, and this also carries into a lot of other code editors that you can command click into multiple lines and then enter code on multiple lines simultaneously. That can be a great way to speed up your production. So now my image object here, function image object, we can see curly closes over to there. We have the instance variables, which are then populated with the values that are passed in. And then it has its display method, where it now puts the image 3 times on screen. So it creates a kind of a looping image across the background. If your background is one giant image, and you just made one giant complete image, then of course you wouldn't have these other 2 lines. It would just stop. It all depends on how you program it. But for here, I created a tileable background image, so then it loops across and creates a seamless three-peat of itself. So I'm going for the low-hanging fruit right now of trying to do the easy classes first. I really don't want to dig into this one quite yet. As you can see, I'm going to have to put in the word this a gazillion times into the enemy, into the unicorn and stuff. So we're trying to take care of the easy ones first. Now, when I look at the timer here with it, and this process is going to be pretty much the same for almost all of our classes as we migrate them, is I can get rid of that, type in function, and now we can get rid of this curly brace there. So I can now click on the bottom one. It highlights underneath the top ones, showing its partner or its mate. So we know which curly brace goes with which item to make sure that we're doing things correctly here. And now we don't need the word int anymore because we don't have to type our parameters that are being passed in as part of it. And now this dot interval is equal to our time interval. And there was a start time, which I forgot. If I look here, we had start time. Start time didn't get defined inside the constructor. So if I try and run this, start time will be null. And then if we're trying to use start time later on, our timer is going to fail, and we'll be like, what's going on? Why is this failing? So, that was probably lazy coding that start time wasn't at least constructed with an initial value. So we can just set it in its beginning. It's a variable, so we can just keep resetting it as needed. Now, I can double click on both of these. These are methods that will be replaced with the word function. So start time is going to be using the millis. So we do get the same kind of basic timer commands and elements that we had inside of processing inside of the P5.js time library as well. Now let's see here where it says int elapsed time. Int is going to be replaced with the word var because we, again, don't type our variables. We just use that as is. And then we can return true and false. That's fine. But now, if I look at start time is needing, in both of these places, the word this. If I look at elapsed time is local to right here. So elapsed time is generated on the fly right here, so it does not need the word this. But interval is a variable from up here, so it uses the word this. So the difference is if I create a variable inside a set of curly braces, so it's inside this set of curly braces, so that variable is only being referenced and used inside of those curly braces. I do not need to use the word this on it. this is used for variables that are going to be used across multiple sets of curly braces. So interval, I need to be able to access it here and have stored that value, because my constructor, I want to pass that time interval down to my complete function, and the only way is to then store it as an instance variable. So I have to use the word this. Start time, because I need to be able to track that every time I call the start function and use it inside of two functions. It has to be an instance variable. But if it's just a straight function variable, so it's used within a single set of curly braces and not outside of it, then we will use the word var to describe that variable. So with this, I think the timer object is mostly wrapped up, and we've hit most of our lower hanging fruit. Oh no, platform is still an easy one, so platform won't be an easy one. Very shortly we're moving into the more complex ones, and then it's going to get ugly. So when I look inside of platform, I can get rid of xy width height type of half width half height, xy width height type of half width. So before I delete the variables, it is always a good idea to just make sure they're all being defined. And now I can put in the word function. Go and delete all of these parameter types that we don't need any longer. Get rid of that. And then I just need to click through. Add in this dot. And that should take care of my different platforms. Continuing the conversion, we'll move into the bullet one. So xy width height, half half, vx vy in motion, and my 4 bounds. Okay. So I always want to go through the variables that I've listed up here and make sure that they are going to be part of it, because when I look what's going on up here, so it's important that all the variables are being defined. When I was doing a conversion test earlier, I started with the project without images, then I added in the images, but then I forgot to put in current frame as a value. So current frame was coming up as null. So then when I'm trying to display something based on the current frame, it kept giving me error messages and wouldn't show it, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized I never defined that as a variable. So then I'm trying to use something that doesn't exist. So it's null, and then it got really grumpy and unhappy with me. So we do have to always, before doing any conversion, look through your different variables, make sure that they are showing up inside the constructor, and then you can safely delete what was there. And now that curly brace will go away. Oh, I just want to check one more. I just want to make sure that we have the correct number of curlies going on. So now I have the word function that will occur for replacing all of my function returns and insert it at the beginning. This being able to click into a bunch of places and then just type once is a huge time saver when you're doing this. If you do it manually, you're probably really going to hate life after a while. So just saying. All right. So now I'm just command clicking. And always remember, if you're setting a value based on something that you set earlier, so it's instance variable, it's going to be really important that you, on the right side of the equals, you put it there as well. And now I can go through and delete all of my parameter typing because we don't need that any longer. Now, UX, UI, UW, that's the, and U facing right, this is, we're passing in the unicorn's values. So those don't need the word this because those are going to be parameters that we're passing in. And I can tell you that that does matter and is important because when I did my first conversion, I added this to everything on the right side of the equals here as well. So it completely messed up where my bullets were not showing up on screen. Then they weren't showing up in the right place, and it was a complete mess. I was like, what is going on? And then I realized I got overzealous by adding the word this into the whole of the project. All right, so now going to the reset. And when you are command clicking to put things in, if you realize you click in the wrong spot, just click on that spot again and it takes the cursor out of that place. Also going to say that it is something that you will probably be happier doing this not on a laptop. Oh, couldn't undo that one. Because if you try and do this on a laptop, it's much harder to manage this on a trackpad than it is with a mouse. The reset method, this is something that is part of the bullet class, or now the bullet function object. So I do need to, because I'm referencing a method that it knows how to do inside of itself, I need to put this in front of that as well. Otherwise that will cause an error. Now when I'm working with max and min as part of this, one thing is I don't need the word math in there, and technically in processing we didn't need it either, but it's nice to remind ourselves of what that is referring to and coming from. Now when I am looking at this, so I have the unicorn's half width and the unicorn's x, the camera's width and the camera's height. All of these values are, I'm referencing global objects. The camera is a global object, the unicorn is a global object because I will be defining them as part of my main program. So my camera, the window frame, the world bound, all of these things, or the world size, all of these are values that are defined inside my main program at the global level. So because of that, the game world, camera, the unicorn, I will have access to their properties. Now it's probably better if I passed in values to do this instead of referencing other objects from within an object, but for the sake of expediency, this was a easier way of doing it. So that's why when I talk about the camera, I can grab the camera's width. Now, if I'm talking about the X or Y for this particular object, which in this case would be a bullet, any of its properties, I need to use the word this because I'm inside of the object itself. So we will see this where other objects, if they are referencing something, they don't have to use the word this because this is only used inside the object itself. Getting used to putting this on everything and deciding where I do and don't put it is something that is takes a little getting used to as part of working with JavaScript, but this is a very common feature inside of JavaScript when we are using JavaScript objects. So anytime an object is referring to its own properties, its own methods, things it can do, or properties, its x, y, width, height, etc., it needs to use the word this in that usage. So now bullets is done. We've just about run out of objects to work on, which is good. Now we move into the enemy. So enemy has a lot more values that we're looking at: width, height, x, y, v, x, v, y. It's not even using all of those. So if I want to be safe, I could go through and very carefully delete line by line to make sure that I don't leave anything unaccounted for. It does have a lot of variables that aren't currently being used because my enemies are not animating. They're just still a simple rectangle. They don't have images yet. So we don't necessarily have to worry too much about those. So width, height, half, width, half, height, x, y. Then they gain information from the platform, which sets the left and right in the ground. So I think they're all there, so I'm going to get brave and just go ahead and delete that to make room. So we'll leave the cursor there, go into each of the methods that my enemy knows how to do. Replace that with the word function. Then we'll go back up to the top. Get rid of a lot of code that's not being used anyway, because there's no reason to leave all the excess information in here. So now that's going to clean it up a little bit for us to make it easier to work. Enemy, now it was passing in a platform. We're still passing that in. We just don't need to type it. So now everywhere we're using these values, we'll go through and adjust those. So if it's px, that's the platform we passed in as part of defining the values for the object. Alright, hopefully I got every one of those in the first go, but we'll find out when we try and run this. I'm sure there will be a lot of error messages saying, hey, what is this value? And we'll just have to go through and correct them one by one. Game world, that's a global object, so I don't need to add this to the front of it. So you'll see it's really easy to miss like that little -w right there when you're doing this. And then when you run it, you'll find your guys run off the edge, or they don't run off the edge. They just kind of start running and they're floating in space, and you're like, what is happening here? So anytime you miss even just one of those, it will come back to haunt you. Now, moving into the unicorn, we can see that there's going to be a lot of items. I'm just going to cross my finger that all of these are defined in the constructor. All right, so that's going to be a lot of thises that we have to worry about.
Did you ever use like the find function to help that?
So there's a question about using the find function to do a find and replace. And if you know something is used throughout and you want to replace it to something else, such as the word void to the word function, you could use a find and replace to do that across your documents, and that could speed that up. But I find, based on what we have going so far, that the bigger issue would be to get the word this in, and it's not as easy to say, hey, just put in front of every variable, because it won't know global objects versus instance ones. Now, I almost missed this W and H right here, so then that would have given me a really messed up parameter when I need to put this dot in front of it. So we do have to watch for things on the right side of the equals while we are putting them in. So this does get to be a little bit tedious, adding in this into everything. I'm going to leave that sound thing alone for the moment, because we're going to have to disable all the sound temporarily and then re-enable it once we get the whole thing working. So I'm just going to eliminate that sound. And the reason for that is we do need to handle sounds a little bit differently with P5.js than we do inside of processing using the minimum sound library. So because of that, it would make sense not to try and fix that while we're trying to fix everything else, because then we will be going crazy tracking down errors into our project. We'll be much happier if we tackle a few things the same way that we probably don't want to break the whole project into our game states at the same time we're converting. Is do the conversion, then put it in game states, then get the sound working with it. And if we follow that, I think we will have a much happier, less troubling experience. We're nearing the end of this file, and then we just have the main game to redo, and then modify the index file to grab all of these resources, put everything in a more organized folder structure, and with that, our project theoretically will run. So I would say there's a very high probability that we missed adding in a couple instances of this, or put it in on something that we shouldn't have put it on. So we added this to a global property that we did not mean to, and in the process we'll create some conflict in our code. So we do have the same height property that processing had, which gives us the height of the canvas that is currently available. But it probably would make more sense to set it to the game world's bottom, because that height value came in when we had a game world that was the size of our sketch. But now that our game world is larger than the sketch, this is now when we've hit the bottom of the world. Now continuing on into display. Yay, this is the last function for the unicorn. We will have to revisit tinting and coloring things, because it does work a little bit differently as part of this. So we will have to pay attention to that as well. Now notice sprite images I did not put this in front of, because sprite images is a variable that was defined as a global variable in my main game code where I loaded my images. So that's how I'm able to refer to it, because I don't want to be referencing the images or loading the images inside of this object. Now the unicorn, there's only one, but if I loaded the images inside the enemy class or object, then I would be reloading those images multiple times, and that would make sense. So that's why we store it in a global value, and that's my sprite images, but I now have to tell it which one I want to load. So the current frame, I use this as part of it. Then we update current frame and the frame sequence. Okay. So theoretically, that takes care of the unicorn. And everything now except for our main file. So now it's time to go through the main file. The strobing color on the background is something that we do have to process now a little bit differently. So moving into the next stage, our main program, as this one gets modified, it's going to be a little bit different as I work my way through. This is not going to be creating an instance object where I need to then worry about using the word this. So the word this is just going to be overused through a lot of this. Well, I can't stop saying this. All right. Now, as we set this up, some things come out a little bit differently. So var u instead of a unicorn, and then we will populate that as a new instance of u in a little bit. So before, where I deleted everything outside of my constructor, we don't have a constructor. We're going to have our setup and our setup and draw that we'll be working with here. So we will have to change all of the voids, but we'll kind of work our way down the list. Now, int, not going to use that anymore. It will be var. When I have arrays are going to be done a little bit differently. So what I can do with that is take this beginning stuff and say var, and then platforms is going to be equal to an array. So we can set it up as equal to an array right now. And we could just say var platforms and then assign it as an array a little bit inside our setup, but I like having that up here now, so that gives me that visual reminder of this is going to be an array element. Now, the same way that we've done before, we're able to replace a lot of these now just with the word var as we put it in. And enemies will be an array again. Oh, I missed my equal sign. Put that in. And when we get to music in a moment, we'll have to define that a little bit differently. So we have the different sound effects that we are working with here. We're not using the minimum sound library. So as it is, you can just define these all as vars. Could again put those on one line if we were so motivated to do so. Now, all of my voids, this is where I could do find and replace, but I don't have that many functions. And right now, especially being this is my very first, our first real conversion, I think it's a good idea to do it manually so we're paying attention to all of the functions that we are working with here. So I've replaced void on everything. So our initial variables are now defined with the keyword var function. But now we're not going to use size, but instead I have to use create canvas, because this is now the term that is used by P5.js. Now, something else that's going to need to move out of our project here, out of the setup, and that is where I'm loading images. So where we load an image, we need to then not do it inside the setup. P5.js gives us access to a preload function. So with this function preload, and in my preload function, that is where we can now load our different elements. So I can load my images. I can load my sounds. I could load fonts. So we have a lot of different things that we can load as part of this. So when I go to load this, so we can now, just going to comment it out. So I'm going to move this image line. So I load the images inside my preload. So I will load sounds and load images inside my preload function. And the reason for doing that is that means the images will be loaded before the program then tries to access them. Because if my setup and draw try to access an image file before that file is loaded into memory, it could generate an error, or just not perform correctly, or both. So having a preload, this relieves us of the obligation of having to write a preload script where we say load these assets and don't go forward until we know that they're loaded into memory. So it's nice that it's built into it. So a lot of third-party libraries, when you're working with JavaScript, have this kind of preload functionality built into it to safeguard your programming so that it doesn't generate errors of trying to access something before it's ready. So otherwise, when I load back image and I say I'm passing in the landscape image, well, it'd be hard to pass in that image if the image isn't already into memory. So that's why we need to make sure we've loaded it under preload first. Now I have my background image. Eventually we'll have multiple images. And then I'm going to need to bring in my sprite images into my item here. So I'm going to copy that, comment that out, because we don't need that there any longer. And we'll go up here and paste it in. Now I need to define the frames. Now sprite images we go up here. Sprite images was defined as an array. But unlike processing, we don't have to tell it how many frames are in that array when we construct it. Processing wants to know how many frames are in an array when you make an array, otherwise it gets grumpy with you. Here we don't have to do that. We don't even have to tell it what's in that array, so we can just get rid of that. So sprite images was set up as a variable. Frames was set up there. Now we give frames its value, and then we're going to load the unicorn images into that. Now, something else that I'm going to have to pay attention to here, processing is able to find it. If those files are in the data folder, it knows to look in the data folder. Our URLs, as we use those, our path names here inside of JavaScript, it doesn't know that. So we have to tell it how to find that. So if I look at the relationship, I can see that the files here are inside my data folder. So now I need to modify this path and say data/unicorn, data/landscape2, because that's now loading the image that is inside that data folder. So I have to tell it, go find it there. Now, if I don't like the word data and want to use something like assets or even images, I could do that. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to have this folder called assets. And inside of that, we have a subfolder called images and a subfolder called sounds. And then we're loading from those. We would just need to make sure that our path names inside our preload point to the correct folder. As long as we're in the preload folder here, we might as well load our sounds. So when I look, my sound files are in a subfolder called sounds, and we can see there are the file names. So if I want to load a sound here, such as my music, then I can just simply say music is equal to load sound. So it's just like load image, but now we're loading a sound, and we have to specify the path. And it would be data/sounds/bitquest.mp3. Now, most of my sound files, since they're all in the same folder, I'm going to copy paste this to access those. Later on, we will have our additional sounds and music for our different game states. But for now, we're going to grab bitquest as our main game music. So we need our dead, ding, hit, jump, shoot, dead, ding, hit, jump, shoot. SFX dead, SFX ding, SFX hit, SFX jump, and shoot. Now we need to grab the correct sound file, dead, ding, hit, jump, shoot. So these sound files have been loaded into memory, so we have access to them, and we can tell that particular sound file to play if we so desire. So technically, we could probably wander back over into the unicorn, because when the unicorn is jumping, it's only able to, once it's jumping, it doesn't take input about jumping again. So we could tell our sound to play, and we'll put that in. The sound effects, because they're short and don't really overlap, it's not a big deal for figuring out how they play. They're sound objects, and we can just tell that sound object to play. But for the music, it does require some more thought as to how we want to go about doing it, because when we want to transition from one music piece to a different one, we have to then stop the music that is currently playing and then tell the new music to start playing. So it requires a little planning to pull that off better. Okay, so now that loads our different sounds in there and gets that going. So now we're going to start working our way through the canvas and getting that set up. So with this, looking at create canvas, that replaces our size statement. But now, everything else so far starts to look about the same as we work with this. So we don't have to go through and change that. We don't have to change this. If we want a new unicorn, we say U is equal to a new unicorn. For creating our platforms are going to be are pretty much the same, except we don't have to define that platform value, so we can get rid of that. And then the platforms are all new platform with the same parameters being passed in. So again, parts of this are going to be the same. The bigger difference is modifying the individual object classes. But within our main program, a lot of it is going to all be the same. Now, we don't have to say how many enemies are going to be in it, because processing doesn't care. P5 doesn't care. JavaScript doesn't care. When I make an array, I can just start populating it, and I can add to and subtract from that array as I see fit down the road. Again, it does not care. Now, here, where we have bullets.length, well, bullets.length doesn't really exist yet. But if I were to say something like var number of bullets is equal to 100, put in number of bullets, then it populates the bullets and gets that going. Firing timer. We may have to adjust this a little bit because our frame rate is faster in P5 than it is inside of processing. So this 50 might end up being a little bit too fast. Now we are probably not going to need to tell the firing timer to start here. Notice it says shift to the appropriate state function when states are implemented. So we will need to do that. And we're also going to have to figure out, I'm just going to put a little to-do here. We need to track the number of dead enemies for win-lose state change. So we'll need to do that in a little bit once we add in the states, but we're not doing states yet, so that doesn't really matter. And then if we had a game state, we'd say like game state equals start to set that value here. Now notice these loads, we move this out of our main program. We move this loading now into our preload function. So with that, I'm just going to delete that. We will have some sound stuff that we will need to take care of down the road that we will want to add into the project. So we're off to a good start on this. Now, come back to the draw function in just a little bit, because the draw function is referencing a lot of other functions or methods that are contained later on inside my program, so I will want to reference those later. So our play sound effects, we're going to do something with this down the road, but in the meantime, I'm just going to get rid of some things. So this will be rewritten, but it's now at least not going to cause issues of trying to have parameter typing going on. And I'm just going to comment that out so it doesn't get picked up by the compiler and try and do something. Now, rectangle collisions, player versus enemy. We don't need to type our parameters. And then we'll change these values to vars as part of it. So that's player versus enemy. Now if we look at bullet versus enemy, we're going to see an interesting thing occur. So inside of processing, we could have two functions that essentially were doing the same thing, taking different parameters. We can do that here, but when we're done, what we're going to notice is these two functions are now 100% identical. Because we don't have to pass a particular type, we just pass two objects in, we really only need one of these kinds of things. Now this function of the unicorn versus the platform, it's doing a whole lot more stuff with overlaps and everything else. So that one will be different and we will keep that one. But under these, the player versus enemy or the bullet versus enemy, we really only need to use one of those. I'm going to leave them here for now, but we are only going to need one as we go forward. Now, as we move into the collision between the platform and the player, as we look at what's going to happen with that, replace our floats with vars. Again, do some basic replacement. Done. Now, displaying the UI on here, it draws this rectangle that fills across the top of the screen, and it gives us some different information on there. We'll probably end up replacing this instead, this text, which is no longer going to be a string, but is just going to be a var. We'll replace that with some other information like keeping track of a score. And we'll probably change this text to be where we can show the score the same way that we're drawing in the health bar as well, and putting that on screen. But we don't have a score yet, so we can leave it. I'm just going to get, because I know I don't really care about any of this anymore being here. I'm just going to put it in. Score is 0. And one thing that we will want to put in here, because it will become important later, we will want to set the text align to our text to left, because when we put in text for the game states, we're using centered text. And once we set text align, it stays that way until we set it otherwise. So this is just a preventative measure that guarantees our text will be aligned to the left. It's the default, but once we put in something else, it kind of breaks it. All right, so that takes care of everything except my draw. So now we need to go back through the draw and work on fixing the contents of that. Inside of the draw function, we're wiping the background. Not really necessary since we're under display. The first thing that we do inside of our background here is we display our image, which covers the whole background, and then we put stuff on top, but we'll leave it there for now. Okay, so we can tell the unicorn to update. Now every time, I think I have to go fix something up top here. Inside my for loops, where it says int, now needs to say var. Yep. Number of bullets, var. Platforms, for enemies var, and that would be my sprite images under my preload. I bet yep, right there, var. So it's really easy to forget when in a for loop that instead of int I, it's now var I. Speaking from experience on that particular one. All right, so as we work forward. So let's see, go through updates for the unicorn. Now for the enemies. Var, now we check, are my enemies and stuff colliding? If so, we can tell it to play the sound that we have now died, or that the enemy has died when they collide there. Now moving into the, if I push space, if the firing timer is done, we can tell the shooting sound effect to play, the next bullet to fire, pass into it where to fire from, restart the firing timer. A couple vars to put in there, otherwise we've modified that. Now we move the camera. Nothing to change there. Now one thing that we have to do is when we use push and matrix, pop matrix inside of processing, inside of P5, it's just going to be push and pop. So that's the only change that we have to make there. But then I do have, when I'm updating all my platforms, bullets, and enemies, update that to a var. Now, modifying the background color so that if we're on the ground, this did not translate correctly into P5. Going to comment that out and just do it a little bit different. Instead, we're just going to fill it with a transparent color. And I can specify that using RGB A. And then go 255, 0, 0, 0.5. Now, one thing about this is the transparent RGBA fill color uses 0 to 255 for the RGB values, but it uses 0 to 1 for the transparency value, because it's using the same value system that RGBA uses for CSS. So that's what JavaScript uses when we're specifying the color that way. Now you also notice how it turns this transparent red on screen, and that's because I am using the pigments package, which then shows me colors. When I specify a color like that, it shows that color on screen with that designation. Now I can just simply draw a rect that's going to be down 100, and it'll be the width of the camera and the height of the camera. So that's now going to fill it in. Eventually we'll work on a strobing thing, but this now makes the whole world turn red when you're standing on the ground. Now, if my health is less than or equal to 0, that's where I'd probably want to change my game state to lose, and then transition to that when we move into adding in game states. But because this doesn't have game states yet, we're not going to see that happen. Now that I have modified the JS for all of my files, the next thing that I can do is get rid of the now extra PDE files. And then I need to bring over the correct P5 files into this directory to make that work. So the PDE files are deleted. I am going to I'm going to create a folder here. I'll call it scripts. And I'll put that in because then what I'm going to do is put in copies of the P5 files that I need into that folder. So I will copy those, copy this add-ons folder, and then choose paste. So we can now see those files are in my scripts folder. The next thing I want to do is to copy over the index file, paste it in, and now we have the index. Now, looking at the path name, from index, the P5.js script is now in my scripts folder. And then we can see that that's where that exists. Now my add-ons are also going to be in that scripts folder. So the .. said go up a directory because from index it says go up a directory to get out of the empty example, and then that puts you into accessing those files. So we say from our index file here, go into the scripts folder, and then you can find these different files. Now my main JS file, so I could put the rest of these all in it, but I'm going to leave them there for now. Now my main project is no longer called Sketch, but instead is going to be P13 Sound is its current name. Probably want to rename that, but we'll leave that for now. So I'm accessing this JavaScript file from my index file. These files are now all accessing the images in the data. And if I choose Open in Browser, it opens up. In the browser, it says loading. And if I pull up the console, we can see where we get all kinds of error messages. And the primary thing is because we're doing the cross-origin blocking, and it's unhappy. Because we're trying to load assets into our project, and that's not going to work right now. But instead, what we need to do is turn on the live server when we do that, and then it loads our project. And now let's see what it is. And image object is not defined. So at line number 62. So now if I look inside my file and go find line number 62, let's figure out why is it unhappy here. So it can't find image object. And once I fix that, it's going to work its way down through. Because if I look in my project here, the first time that I tried to load a new class, because right now I loaded assets into variables. This is the first new reference to one of my class files. It can't find image object because my document never loaded that file. So even though I can see the files here, I never loaded image object. So now if I save this and go back over here, now it comes up and now it says it can't find frame object. And I'll be like, what? Oh, frame object is the next new thing it tries to do. So what I have to do is go through in my index and load each one of these files. And then once I load all of those files, then my main program will have access to their contents, and then it should be able to load them. So having added these different files in, I can now save my document, cruise over here, and it now tells me, all right, so this is what I should be expecting is I should have some missing curly braces. So inside of enemy, So if we go into enemy, it's set at line 99. So that goes with that. That one goes there. All right, and there's my initial. So that should take care of enemy. Now go into unicorn. So as I said at the beginning, this really becomes a matter of we're deleting. So this is what's nice, this package of live server, is every time I save it refreshed the server, so I'm not even having to reload the page. So now my platform must have one, so let's go find platform file. Yep, there it is. So I forgot to delete that out of a bunch of my constructors, and firing timer start is not a function. So line 105. So if I comment this out, save it and watch it reload, now it comes up and says uUpdate is not a function. So what this is telling me is I have a curly brace in the wrong place somewhere within one of my files, and that is then throwing off the sequencing, and that's why it can't find it correctly. So it's now going to be a matter of figuring out which place or which class still has a misplaced curly on it. And once we can find that misplaced curly, then it will clean it up. So now I'm going to move to the next level of debugging. So I've commented out everything inside of draw. And it still is unhappy with the firing timer. So I realize I just did kind of a big goof. So now our main functions, when we're on the kind of the main thread, we begin them with the word function. But if we're putting methods inside of an object, so our platform object, so what we instead want to say, this display equals function, because that is a method that this object knows how to do. The same way that this object has its own properties, x, y, width, height, it also has its own method of display. So we have to use this display equals function, which now when we go through here, so it's this dot equals function. So I have to go through each one of my objects that I worked on and update them. As I had in my head after looking at the setup and draw, the word function, because we are using function, but we have to make it a method for this object. Frame object doesn't have any, so it's good to go. The unicorn, after its main one here, so we have update. Check platforms, check boundaries, display. So this dot equals function. So this is again part of the refactoring the code to go from what is in essence one language into another. Requires us to tweak things a little bit. This is not bad practice, though, in terms of having to go through and learning how to both refactor as well as to look for issues. Now, if I couldn't do the multiple updates at once and had to do each one at a time, then this would be significantly more tedious. So that should now clean up those. We can go back into it and undo the nuclear option. So when you are working on something, and if you find that you're getting lots of errors in your code, commenting all or most of it out and adding it back one piece at a time can sometimes help you to find what is going on. So enemy now has an unexpected token. Go figure out where that is. Line number 60. Oh. Apparently I missed that one. Oh, and wow, I really botched enemy here. This displays function. So unicorn. Oh, line number. So I always look for that line number. It shows you where that is, so I can get to it a little bit faster. I'm referencing, I want the unicorn to check its boundaries, so I say this dot check boundaries. Ooh, did I just mess that up on the enemy? I think enemy, when he's moving, enemy will need the same thing, because we're asking him to use his method of check boundaries. So each one, we don't want one enemy checking the boundaries for all the enemies, because they can be on different size platforms at different places on their platform, moving differently on the platforms. So they need to use the word this, so they're using their own thing. Otherwise, it gets confusing. And collision side is not defined, 125. Oh yeah, missed a couple this is there. And okay, turn red, health is going down. And it's shooting, it's playing the sound, but we're having a little difficulty moving at the moment. So, progress. We've made progress. That we can forget to put this as in, we can get overzealous. Left and right, up and down, are not, they're global properties, they're not unicorn specific properties. If I look up here, I don't see left, right, up, or down on the unicorn, because like left and right are modified in my main program. When I press a key, it says left, right, up, or down. So I got a little overzealous by putting in this under left and rights and up and down. because they're not unique to the unicorn. Left, right, up, and down are just simply values that are set globally when I press the keys on the keyboard. So once we get rid of those, Mr. Unicorn and the game is working. So everything is now behaving the same except for the music, because I haven't told the music to play. So it works. So moving to the next phase of the project is converting it into a game state system so we can start, play, win, lose. And doing that, I'm going to take a look at my previous project that I had under game demo that we looked at in our prior session. So we need the game states that we'll work with. So we'll copy and migrate that code over into the project. And that will be at the start of draw. So at the start of draw, that is where we can start putting in the game state stuff. This also means I will need a game state variable that I'll be working with as part of it. And in my initial setup, I will want to set my game state equal to start. So that will get me prepped for what's going on. So now we notice here it's calling these individual functions as part of it. To facilitate making this a little bit easier, one thing that we can do is we can break this into individual separate files. So this as separate JS files to make our code a little bit more manageable. So separating start, play, win, and lose, and pulling it out of the main function. To facilitate that, we can add in some new files, and I will name them after the function that they're going to be. So one will be start game, and then win game.js, and I just decided I want to change the naming of them so that they're all easier to find. And it will be state lose.js, win game. Rename this as state win.js. And state start.js. So if start, lose, win, and now I need my final one, which will be state play.js. So as I look through my different states that I have here, they're currently all empty. I'm going to borrow some content from the, if I look at game demo, within game demo, look at start. Not going to worry about the music yet. But I can copy that content, move over into my state start file, function start game, paste, Now, as we do this, we need to just update so we're following the correct syntax that P5.js wants. Don't have a countdown timer. The music part with this, we will be doing something with in a little bit. Now, looking at this mouse pressed, and that as we look through the documentation on P5.js, we see that mouse pressed is actually mouse is pressed inside of P5.js, so I'll just change that. Mouse is pressed, and that will change the game state to play. Now, if I try and run the whole project right now, we'll run into some issues. So we really just need to finish out these different states. But what I'm going to do is put in just some basic background colors so we can tell that it's, or how it's working. Now, moving over into the win and lose, we'll go back into the game demo. And just copy this whole function for win, paste, change that to function, change that to var. Mouse is pressed. Now we will need a reset game. We will look at that in a little bit as we try and figure out how that part is going to work. Our text is quite a bit off since we haven't put anything else of merit there yet. Go to game demo. Lose. Paste it in, comment out the music, add in is. Comment out music and reset for now. String becomes var. All right, so now we have lose completed as well. The next thing we need to do is go and grab what used to be inside of draw, and all of that is going to go into, that's a lot. All of that is going to go into our play game. And in doing all of this, what's nice as we work our way through is it now separates out the code a little bit. It makes it a little bit easier to keep track of what is going on. So we still need to figure out a reset and put all of that in. So now my basic states are there. Win music, we don't have that yet. Should put in a background. Do a nice bright yellow when you win. Lose. Different color. And the game is the game. Don't care about game demo anymore. Close that out. And then play draws artwork in the background. Now, this firing timer, we still need to keep track of winning and losing, but this firing timer is probably going to want to switch itself over and get fired up at the when we click the button in the start state. So we'll just comment that out of there. Go over to the start state. Paste that in. Save. And now, if I try and run it, we're going to get a horrible failure because we're now missing a couple of the files. Because we have the state start, state play, state win, state lose. If you're working still directly in processing and you separate your states into individual PD files, again, that would be very similar to working with this. It cleans up your code, makes it a little bit easier to keep track of what is going on while you're working on the project. Now what we can do is go under packages, fire up the server. Now we can see the text needs to be updated. And as we can see, I'm playing, but nothing's happening as far as being able to win or lose. And that is because inside of our game state, under play, if my health drops below, we should set our game state equal to lose. We also now have no way to win. So with this, what makes sense to do is to then track within our game so that we track two values. It would be nice as we're working if two more values, if the game state, we can have a score, but we should also then have the number of enemies that we've dispatched. Because if we run into them or shoot them, that eliminates the enemy and makes the enemy play dead. So we need to know how many, because otherwise, if I run into some and shoot some, I can't use score as a way to track, hey, have I maxed out for the level or not. Now we can set these values. Right here. Score is equal to 0. Enemies dispatch is equal to 0. So now we've taken care of that. Now inside a play game, when we're here, if the player runs into the enemy, my enemy's dispatch goes up by 1. If I successfully shoot a player or shoot an enemy, my score goes up by 1, and my number of enemies dispatched also goes up by 1. So now going back down where we were checking to find out about losing, we can also find out, have I won? And that would be if my enemy's dispatch is equal to my enemies dot length, which is how many enemies are in the enemy array. And if that's the case, my game state is equal to win. But what this means is we can win, we can have a different amount of points for winning, which it would be a combination of how many have I shot versus how many have I dispatched. Now going back into the main project, under displaying the UI, before where we said score 0, now we can say score is equal to score plus score. So we're displaying the amount. And then on the next line, so then I will use the /n to do a line return. I'm just going to keep track of how many enemies have been dispatched for now. So it will now provide that information for the player while they are working in the game. So now we can see score, enemies dispatched. And let's see. And I won. Gotta clean up the text. If I click, it's pretty obvious that it's not working right because enemy dispatch is still 8, though my score was 3. So that's why every time I try to reset the game, I can't. So this is where we now need to call the reset function before going back into our game. So if we think about the different items that we have to work with here, we need to create quite a number of values that we're working with. So we can do function reset game, and inside of this function, score is going to be equal to 0. Enemies dispatch will be equal to 0. We need to tell the player to reset. And I know that's there, or actually, is it there? Display, no, there is no reset yet on the player, so we're going to have to work on that, otherwise it's going to be a little bit grumpy. So we need to add a reset function into our player, our enemies, and then we can reset all of those different values. So looking through the Unicorn file, I'm going to just put my reset function here because it's easier to grab the things I need above it. So this dot reset is equal to function. And the items that I want to reset, I want to set my x and y, my vx, vy, acceleration, x, acceleration, y. And I need to, my on ground value as well. So copy those, paste it over. Speed limit shouldn't have been changed, so we're not too worried about that. But essentially we're zeroing out all the movement. We're not on the ground because he starts above a platform. Then we set the x and y so it dumps it in the center of the game world. So with this, the Unicorn has had its properties reset, so we can now call that. So now we can see how we've called the Unicorn. But what we also need to do is reset the enemies. Now resetting the enemies is a little bit different because if I look at the enemies receive information of where to begin and what they can do based on a platform. Because when we construct an enemy, we give it that platform information. But now that it's been moving and fallen off of its platform, it doesn't really know what its values are anymore. So we can re-provide that information for them. So with this, we can use a for loop. So we set I equal 2, and what I'm doing is I'm essentially recreating them, but then I'm going to be telling the enemy to reset. But I'm not making new versions. So if I go and just grab this content right there, and forgot I was putting reset up high here somewhere. So with the reset, paste it in, but instead of creating new ones, now we're just going to tell each enemy to reset itself, and we'll pass in that platform, from the platforms array. So we pass in that particular platform so it knows that information. So it's just like when we created it, but instead of saying equals a new enemy with this information, we're now calling reset. So if I go back into the enemy method here, with that we're going to want the x and y, left edge, right edge, and ground, vx, vy, acceleration. So we can go grab these different properties, and then let's start out with this dot reset is equal to function, and inside of this function I can just simply paste those values in. So now that resets it back to its original information, and then we just need to reference the platform that is being passed into this reset function. So now the enemy has been put in. Also, beyond the score and the enemies, we should also reset the health back to its maximum value. Now, if 100 doesn't work for you and use something else, you should probably have a health value that you're resetting. Then that way you just change it once up here instead of having the number 100 appearing here and down there, because if I want to update things, it could get pretty ugly pretty quick. So going back into the browser, page has been reset. I'm just going to pull up console to make sure nothing magic appears there. All right, I win. And well, I put all of the reset in. I just realized inside of state win and state lose, I never got around to recalling those methods. So now, if I play, see if I can. Okay, I lost. Click. Now it's back down to 0. Health is back up. But if I notice here, there's something else going on that I can't. When I run into them, nothing happens. I can shoot them, but I can't dispatch them by running into them. If I look at my play state and look into what's happening with collisions, I will see that when I shoot them, I check to also see if the enemy is dead. Because I don't want to shoot an enemy that I have already run into. It's in the air, then I try and shoot it, I would get double credit on points, and that'd be bad. But if I just run into it, it only checks to find out if the enemy, so here the enemy is dead. Here the bullet can do it. But what we do need to do on this one, looking on the enemy, while I'm resetting everything, the one thing I never reset is their dead property to bring them back to life. This dead is equal to false. Because when they are shot, it's in the enemy's function takes care of that. When they get hit under death jump, they're dead. They now get made dead. So now going back here, I can play. So I lost. And I can play. So I can win and lose now as part of it. So the next feature to integrate is the music. The next feature that I want to explore here is adding in the music. I had my play sound effects function there. We're not using that playing sound effects, but I am going to kind of modify this and just call it music player. And I'm going to pass in two values, music off, music on. So every time we call this, we're going to tell these two sound objects to do something. I'm going to tell my music off to stop, and then I will tell music on to jump. And the reason I'm using jump instead of play is if I use jump with no parameter, it jumps to the beginning of the sound and starts playing that music. So what we need to do is at each time we change game states, we need to then call this music player and pass into it the music we're turning off and the music we're turning on, and then that will allow one background track to play at a given time. I'm also going to load in some additional background images to display so that I can show these images during the different game states, so it's more interesting than the boring colors. First up, what I want to do is to load in some additional assets. Now when I look at the assets that I'm trying to load, currently I have my backgrounds I've created for lose, start, win. I'm using landscape 2 as my scrolling background image. So with that, I think we'll do a little renaming of this and put it in. But I also want to create some assets here. So landscape is the back image that displays during the play state. And that one animates, it's a little bit different. During my start, win, and lose, I have a static image that I'm working with. So I can just tell that image to display on screen at that point. So with this, I'm going to load my other images. So we have landscape, and I'll have my start image, win image, lose image. My start image is going to be equal to load image, and it's in the data folder, and the file is going to be background start.png. After the start image, there will now be the win, and lose. So that now loads my images for the backgrounds that I can display. The next thing that I can do is load in my additional sounds that I'm working with, because I have music that I want to play for my different game states as well. Now with this, it will be var, and it will be start music, play music, win music, lose music. I need to now load those inside here. So I have music for my start, play, win, and finally lose. My play music is BitQuest. And then my win music is PS win, and my lose music is SP lose. So all of these audio tracks are from Kevin MacLeod on Incompetech. I have to still update the remaining names up there, but they're all fantastic music choices. So now I have my 4 kinds of music that I'm going to be working with. I've preloaded them. Notice inside preload we're loading our images and loading our sounds to get them ready to go. Then inside the main item, what we're going to do now that those audio pieces have been assigned values is before or as I'm firing off my game state here, then we can say music player. And now if we remember, music player has 2 values that are going to go into it. The music I want to turn off, and I could specify any one of my music. But what I can't do is I can't tell the start music to turn off and to turn it back on. It freaked out when I tried to do that. So even though play music isn't playing, I'm just going to tell it to start and tell that music to stop. And we could pass in nothing there, a null, and then we could be checking for that inside our function if we were doing error checking, but that's beyond where we want to go right now. So this command here, music player. Now, music has started playing automatically because I saved this file, which refreshed the page, which allowed the music to start playing. So I'm going to comment this. All right, so now the music is stopped. We'll bring that back in a little bit after I've gone into my other states. So when I go here into my states, so now I can tell the music, the play music to stop, the lose music to start, play music to stop, the win music to start. You can save that, go into win. Inside of win, I'm going to change that in just a moment. Now we can tell the music, we can tell our win music to stop and our play music to start. Also going to, instead of loading or displaying a background image, we have our additional backgrounds that I've loaded here. So I can say image at 0, 0, and then, oh wait, say the image file that I want to show, and the image is going to be, so win, lose, and start. So win image, and display it at 0, 0. Now if I go to lose, display an image, this will be lose image at 0, 0. Now we can tell our lose music to stop and our play music to begin. And play, when lose, image, start image. Here. Now we tell our start music to stop, play music to begin, and display the background image of start image at 0, 0. If I go back into the main project, now we can re-enable this line, save it. Changed. So far that's working. If we look at the win state, don't need any of that text. With the lose state, so now all the extraneous text is in the music is there. One final thing that we will want to do to our audio files that we have put in. So we have these different music pieces that we're working with, and we need to set the looping property because by default the sound will play through once and be done. So that's not really a preload feature, that should be more under setup. So with that, let's go down and say start music, loop, or set loop. Now when we're in P5.js under libraries, under P5 sound, this is where we can start to get more information about what is happening here. So we can see under set loop, we can find out, this sets looping true or false for the sound. So if we're trying to figure out which commands to use, we look through the documentation. So we study this to see what is happening. If I read on jump, we can see it moves the playhead to that position in the song. If no time is given, it will reset and play the entire duration start to finish. So that's why saying jump with no parameters provided automatically jumps it to the beginning and makes it start playing. So reading through the documentation can give you additional insight in how to work with your assets and with your files. So now we have a completed project.